everything in addiction causing problems in treating actual addiction, because that physical and social dependency, I mean, my stepfather smoked for years. He quit multiple times. That social, people would go out for a cigarette and talk. That's what dragged him back in. It was other people smoking around him every single time. And it was tough for him to quit. Alcohol's brutal. I mean, opioids are a serious issue right now. Highly addictive drugs like heroin. These are actually making your system run at a rate that nothing else can. You can't replace drugs with another activity that gives you the same surge. Right? Some people replace it with exercise or religion or something like that. But let's face it, it's not the same physiologically, correct?
Right. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So calling everything addictive, doesn't that not only really call attention to the underlying health conditions that are like mental health conditions that are causing people to fixate, because it's compulsive behavior, right? It's not a true addiction, but also isn't it sort of cheapening the struggle that addicts face? Because I mean, you're playing too many video games, it's affecting your work. Well, the answer is to cut down on your video games, right? It's not that simple when you're addicted to something, when you're dependent on something.
Right. Yeah. Well, there is a sense of, and I think people like, Mark Griffiths have a point in that, lots of things can be overdone. Right.
Right.
And I mean, like I scuba dive a little bit, like not well. I like to dive 30 feet down and look at fish, but that's about all I do. I'm petrified of drowning. But you get just from being around that community a little bit, I mean, I see people that are really into scuba diving, to the point where some of them will dive into caves where they're not supposed to and die,
Right.
So you talk about an activity that people do and it is interfering, almost anything can, kind of fit into that parameter if you're, so the question becomes why games? Why are we so focused on games? As opposed to all the other things that people sometimes overdo, whether it's scuba diving, work, cats,
food,
whatever, food, absolutely, I would say at this point, to me, the evidence is pretty clear that all of these things, including overdoing it with games, are really due to some sort of underlying mental health disorder that we already know, like depression and anxiety and things like ADHD, in some cases autism spectrum disorders, these things already exist, and people are using games or other things in ways to sort of self-medicate, to distract themselves from their underlying, concerns. So we don't really need, and everybody kind of knows this. Everybody kind of knows that problem gamers have other mental health issues. This isn't like a secret or even like a really controversial thing to say. So there is a kind of question.
It is kind of still controversial. During Gamergate, I floated the idea that what we were actually looking at was potentially a giant autism trigger. And everybody got mad at me. And I talked to people who are like, they want us to die. And I'm like, why? The gamers are dead is a metaphor. They couldn't process the metaphor. They didn't see it as the death of the author kind of thing. They actually thought that these columnists were wishing death on them in some way.
Gotcha.
And they were legit frightened.
Yeah. Okay.
And I don't know how widespread that was. And it was kind of funny to see on Kotaku in action where one person says, she's saying we're all autistic. And, they're like, well, we sort of are. We call our research weaponized autism. I mean, there's a kernel of something here.
Yeah.
I don't think people really understand how neuroatypicality and gaming intersect. And I think, when you reduce someone to a straight, white, cisgendered male, right? You're leaving out socioeconomic hardship, neuroatypicality, and mental illness. Or physical disability as well. All these things are being left out of the intersectional analysis of who plays games.
Right.
Would you be open to you and Brad doing a follow-up study on how many of these white, straight, cisgendered men have another sort of identifier such as physical or mental disability?
That would be interesting. I mean, to do something like that, and and that's true. I mean, these are hypotheses, right? But we don't have
Right.
data on them.
There's nothing.
Yeah,
There's
and I
nothing.
know that kind of argument has also been made. I don't remember the source. I'll be honest with you, I don't remember the source off the top of my head. But I've heard people talk about that in the context of like Twitter as well, not just in that game. The whole idea that like there are these extreme people on both sides of any debate on Twitter, and then there's like the rest of like humanity, right? And so the argument I've seen raised is that the people that are the most extreme on social media as well might have a variety of mental health issues that may help explain why are you this passionate about this. Like there's believing in a cause, and then there's what you're doing,
Right.
And so there has been this argument floated. I've seen that there may be certain type of personality disorders or something else. I don't know that it's specifically autism, or anything like that. But there has been the sort of theory, at least, that that social media may have amplified some more extreme voices that would not normally get as much bandwidth
Right.
under historical situation. In some ways, it's good to get more voices involved, but if it ends up being ugly and nasty, then that might be something we have to look at. But those are empirical questions. Those are in some ways controversial empirical questions, but they're still empirical. And that could be something that could be looked at, whether Brad and I are involved in it or some other group of scholars are involved, looking at the mental health issues of the individuals that have the most extreme views on any topic and are more likely to contribute either positively or negatively to the conversation on that particular issue, and on both sides. So if we kind of look at it from the Gamergate supporters, it's also worth asking, what about like the anti-Gamergate crowd of individuals as well. And they may have a different set of issues perhaps. And I want to be careful that none of this should be meant to disparage individuals with autism spectrum disorders.
No, quite the opposite.
Most of whom are obviously not involved in harassment or things like that. But no, I think those are kind of interesting questions and empirical empirical questions. But I think if you look at like scholars in the field, I think if there's a consensus on anything, there is a sort of sense of like comorbidity, with gaming, whatever you want to call it, pathological gaming, and mental health disorders. But what people don't agree on is whether that means, is gaming disorder really its own thing, or is it really just a symptom?
Is it a symptom?
Of other stuff. And the problem too is, if you look at, like, you briefly mentioned the DSM, and and the DSM don't have a gaming disorder officially yet, but they do have a category for further study, the internet gaming disorder. But if you look at the criteria for that, they're all borrowed straight from substance abuse. So they like literally took heroin out and put video games in.
I was actually kind of stunned. It has to be a year.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't think you let someone sit and rot with anything for a year. You have to, I mean, if somebody's showing trauma symptoms a month after a traumatic event, you get them help. I was stunned that you have to let someone sit there for a year. That sounded political to me. Like, we're going to put it in, but the likelihood is people are going to intervene on something else, one would think, if there's people around that you can get a diagnosis of depression in like a few months.
Yeah. Well, 2 weeks, technically,
Okay. 2 weeks.
So yeah, and there probably are other, and I can't think of one off the top of my head, but there probably are other disorders where you have somewhat longer timelines that are required for diagnosis, maybe personality disorders or something like that.
Yeah. Well, there's an age cutoff, right, for that.
For antisocial.
Yeah.
Not for the other ones. But yeah, they usually want to see a longer pattern of behavior, and maybe to try to defend it, there could be the sense of like, well, everybody occasionally binges on a new game, so you want to see that as a constant rather than you just did it for a couple of weeks when you first got like the new Last of Us game or something like that. But but there are these critiques of like, so you hear people like say with a straight face like, well, if you're using games to make yourself feel better, that's a bad sign. Like,
no.
What?
That's a self-preservation instinct.
Right, but that comes like straight from the DSM's criteria. For what? So it's funny because I will go through like the DSM criteria when I give talks about gaming disorder or something like and I'll go through the internet gaming disorder criteria from the DSM, and I'll just ask somebody, like, they pick a thing that you do that you spend some money on and do a lot. Like, it could be sports or something else. So I get a lot of athletes who will then say, well, I play lacrosse or whatever.
Right.
And then I'll go through there are 9 criteria, and you need 5 of them to be diagnosed. And I'll go through them with someone who plays like soccer, and you go through them, and almost every athlete would contribute to their sport, and almost anybody that has a hobby that they're passionate about would meet DSM criteria for addiction for a hobby.
Which is why you shouldn't self-diagnose over the internet.
And then you probably should be aware of psychiatrists diagnosing you with some stuff as well. But there is this like larger issue, so gaming disorder, obviously touches on a lot of so it touches on issues at the WHO, which have now come up with COVID-19.
Yep.
Very similar sounding, the idea that they are perhaps too cozy with China in particular, and maybe some other countries. And there are a lot of reasons. There's some excellent discourses in the news media about why that has happened. Short version is the WHO used to be pretty good. Now they're not really anymore.
Now that's larger. I'm glad you came back to this, because people would have killed me if I didn't ask the question. That is like what I was talking about with, you can't do games journalism anymore because there's no access. If you piss off one of these authoritarian regimes, they basically lock you out of your country. That's accurate, correct?
Yeah, it's really, I'm not an expert in like the bureaucracy of the WHO, but yeah, it seems to be like a common problem with UN organizations, and now essentially everything is kind of run by bureaucrats and committees that are put together by member states, and it's not so much that China donates the most money. They don't.
Far from it.
Well, I've been told this week, but what China has been very good at is cultivating relationships with other like smaller member states, like, third world countries in particular. So they have a lot of allies,
Africa, other countries in Asia predominantly, correct? Yeah,
absolutely. So that, in other words, they end up having a lot of voting power, in order like this. So that was the thing that came up with, gaming disorders, of course, and some of the personal correspondence I had with the people who were in charge of that at the WHO. They pretty much came out and said that they were under pressure from Asian countries. They didn't specifically mention China, but I think we can, China.
So what I observed was pretty much documented. I mean, it really seemed the big pushes were Japan and Taiwan. They were leaning heavily on this idea, like really playing the media, these anecdotal sob stories of 15-year-olds who died and all that stuff. Yeah, they were really going hammer and tong to get this thing identified.
In South Korea, so I think there was a number of states there, but I think China was probably very influential. I'm guessing, but I think China's probably very influential in that as well.
Could this be? I don't expect you to know for certain, but could this be an attempt of these countries to sort of do a PR thing where, it's not our oppressive regime, it's not the high stress people have, it's not, the lost decade of highly educated, underemployed young people that's causing these issues, it's video games.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to vary from one country. So obviously the politics of South Korea is very different from the politics of China. But I think there is probably a certain trend of, certainly for China, it's useful from an authoritarian perspective as an excuse to reduce speech and such. But, basically all of those countries, even though Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan are all democracies, they're all still more authoritarian in structure than we're used to in the United States or Canada, for instance. So I think there probably is a certain degree of, which we've done in the United States too. They've done it in Germany, Australia, finding a scapegoat for a problem that will distract from other structural issues. So we actually did a myself and colleagues in South Korea did a study with a South Korean sample. And one of the things that was interesting that we found was it was a longitudinal study, so it followed these South Korean kids over time. And what we found is that time spent playing video games was not a strong predictor of developing problematic gaming habits. What was a strong predictor was academic stress. So the more stress that kids felt that they were under, and the more they felt like their parents were pressuring them. So schools and parents, two groups that historically don't like video games, tended to be the real source of problematic gaming, not time spent gaming by itself. I mean, there's like a small correlation there, which make some sense, but it really seemed like the origin was social and structural.
That's true of most adolescent issues, isn't it?
Yeah, well, yeah, as I sometimes say, like, and I'm a parent of an adolescent myself, that as parents, we don't have a lot of control over our kids' good behavior in the sense of whether you're like a tiger parent or a free range parent. Doesn't really matter for the most part. You have a good amount of chance to screw your kid up, though. So in terms of like buying a parenting book, I wouldn't bother. But in terms of like, if you communicate to your kid that you don't like them, or love them, that's bad. And I don't, I'm sure like, ooh, a psychologist said this, so now my eyes are open. But, obviously this is obvious stuff I'm saying, but a lot
people don't realize how they do that. And one of the ways they do that is to crap all over things your kid is super passionate about, like video games.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. When I used to do more therapy, I would get, occasionally I get like goth kids, who I like goth music myself and metal and all that kind of stuff.
Nice.
I would get these parents who bring in their goth kids and say, my kid's weird, fix him, I was like, yeah, yeah. And kind of like gently say, so what message do you think you're communicating to your kid when they have a lifestyle that they like, but you're bringing them in because you don't want them to do it anymore, and the kids otherwise, the grades are fine, they're just dressed funny, and listen to weird music that you don't like,
Who cares?
So yeah, and I was kind of like, yeah, and of course you can't just say that because they'll get defensive. But
of course, like, but I assume you're thinking.
Yeah, they're gonna say like, your kid seems to be doing okay, yeah, I get it. Their friends are strange and they dress funny, and you're a little embarrassed by that, but.
But that's all of the 80s. I mean, that was everybody, right? It seems we have a control issue. Like people just think you can program a child or a young adult the way you can program your DVR to tape Westworld.
Yeah.
And I mean, Westworld's a shining example of the social ills that can come when things are too tightly controlled. We focused a lot on problems. We focused a lot on holes. We focused a lot on sort of the negative optioning. What's some stuff, we'll leave it on an up, that you think can be done to improve things or strengthen either the research or the dialogue?
That's a great question with lots of long answers. So obviously with the research side, it's probably the easier one to address. So what we've had historically is a lot of really bad research, that was not transparent, that was not standardized, and so that allowed, not on purpose. I think there's probably a little bit of bad faith here and there, but most of it was good faith, where researchers would inject their personal views without even knowing it. Into just rerun their data, rerun it until they got what they thought they should, and that needs to stop. And that was true for a lot of social science. It wasn't a gaming thing. It was just, this is like psychology and other fields all have this kind of problem. And so looking at ways of like standardizing our assessments, making sure everybody's using the same measure of gaming disorder, whatever you want to call this thing, same number of questions in the same, and extracting data from it the same way, pre-registering our hypotheses and data analysis in advance so that we can't fiddle with our data when we get it to kind of come up with whatever responses we want, from it. So there are ways of making the science more transparent, more standardized, and better, I think. And I think we'll get clearer answers on a lot of things. I mean, the general gist for a lot of topics in psychology is essentially like at least 2 out of 3 times, roughly speaking, what we thought was true isn't,
Right.
So we're probably going to find out that the things we thought had impact on us probably don't, to a large. In other words, we're probably, and you can spin that in a positive way or negative way. You can either say like, that means we're really resilient, we're really independent, autonomous thinkers, or you can say we're really stupid and we really don't pick up on stuff, much. So you kind of like look at it from either positive or negative perspective.
Or both, depending on the topic. Yeah.
But there are a lot of things that are kind of like, like the whole like idea of like nudge, right? The idea that you can like nudge people into paths that are beneficial for them or for you, with like subtle, and it feels like lots of that probably doesn't work, as a reality.
Right.
People just oblivious, for the most part. But on the dialogue side, it's going to be tougher because, I mean, you can say like, well, we all need to be better in trying to understand other people's perspective, we can talk about an issue that we think is a concern to us, but also try to listen to people that are on the other side who have different views, different viewpoints, find ways to compromise. Is it okay if we have more games like The Last of Us or Horizon Zero Dawn? Can we still have Grand Theft Auto? Is that okay? Is that a compromise we can all agree on? So I think it's kind of nice we can say that we should all be more human to each other, or treat each other like humans more than we do. Be kinder. Type out something and read it before we hit send on that kind of stuff. Have someone else look at it who's less emotionally invested or whatever. But the reality is a lot of people don't have an incentive to do that.
Right.
So
quite the opposite. They have incentives to shut down and not listen. And there's a lot of social benefits to just spewing the hive mind.
Absolutely. So I mean, the incentive is I'm going to say something that is moral for me and my group, what we think is moral, and I would do that at someone else's expense.
Right.
And somehow I think this is a good thing, to do. And occasionally maybe it is. Maybe we're talking about Hitler. Okay. So I did my Godwin's Law thing for the day.
Right. There we go. Yeah.
So, so there probably are some really legitimately horrible people out there that, but there should be a pretty high bar for that, and just the idea that there's a controversial issue and other people feel differently from me on that issue. And that makes them a literal Nazi, is not a great way to think. So I'll pick on the abortion debate again. My big mistake of thinking that both sides have some fair points. That's a good example. Other people can feel very differently from me on something I'm passionate about, and still can be doing so in good faith and have some fair points that I disagree with, but there are fair points. And they are otherwise still a reasonably good human being, or at least as good as I am, or good as anybody else is, and that's a difficult thing, or seems to be a very difficult thing. And maybe we're just not wired to think that way. I think there may be some some evolutionary wiring to look for differences and look for us versus them. But it seems to be very difficult for people to get through that I can believe very passionately about something and still respect those individuals who feel very passionately about the other side of that issue. Doesn't mean I have to give up my passion, but it doesn't mean that they're evil either.
You just touched on a major fulcrum in the whole Gamergate debate. It wasn't just a disagreement. It was the belief that the other side was disingenuous, dishonest, and evil. It didn't stop at it. I've heard it identified as people tend to think about things as right versus wrong, as opposed to right versus right. Like the abortion debate is an example of that. Instead of it being women have the right to choose versus you kill babies, it's women have the right to choose versus all life is precious. Both of these are lofty thoughts, right? It's the same thing of women deserve equal dignity and success, equality of opportunity to men. Also, journalistic ethics matter, and we want to know we can trust the people who are informing and recommending or not recommending various products. We want to make sure there's no agenda outside of consumer advocacy.
Yeah, and I think there was an issue with Gamergate too, that it quickly morphed, in the sense of some of the harassment that Anita Sarkeesian, and others, Brianna Wu and other people experience, absolutely should have been confronted, and absolutely. So we could say if you're threatening someone with rape or something like that, we don't need to compromise and figure out, But
I think everybody agrees with that assertion.
Yeah.
There are more and less effective ways of confronting that, though.
Correct. I agree with you. And
right.
So then threatening them with death in return maybe isn't super constructive.
Well, that's the thing, right? Is I understand I had the urge to sort of leap to people's defense when I saw that going on both sides, right? It was far from a one-way thing. But there's a right way and a wrong way to do that. And it just seemed to be, well, you attack me, so I'm going to attack you. Zoe Quinn called me literally the devil for questioning elements of her account, which was my job as a journalist. I question Aaron, I question Zoe, but then these chat logs leaked. of her calling me literally the devil, and all these people on the anti-Gamergate side scheming to ruin me.
Yeah.
And it was confirmed that these things were legitimate, and these are the good guys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well,
That's,
that's the thing. That's where I think it morphed in the sense it became like,
yeah.
let's not just confront the individuals who were engaged in the actual harassment, but let's like generalize it out to, like I said, anybody who perhaps questions the specific narrative, but then also to all gamers, in a sense of gamer identity. And, so there are these, various, like you said, articles in gamer press that really just shit on gamers as a culture.
Those were weird, and
they were weird. They were strange. Yeah.
To me, that was more these sites. I was like, wow, these sites have no editors, meaning these sites have no money. They're giving people titles and the ability to post whatever they want instead of paying people.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that's its own problem.
Mm-hmm.
And we seem to wanna. One of the things that Gamergate did that was really unfortunate is it destroyed the monetization model of the games press.
Mm-hmm.
And so we got more of that pedantic, strident op-ed because nobody has the money to do anything else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you think it's similar, bringing it back to sort of broader things, and we'll leave it here. Do you think this idea of we solve the problems with the World Health Organization by defunding the World Health Organization, is this sort of the same solution that's going to make the problem worse?
Yeah, that's a great question. So obviously, another issue people have a lot of passionate views on.
Yeah.
And I think I find myself somewhere in the middle. I mean, so my observation is that I'm being kind of asked to pick between two bad sides. I think in a way that I think the WHO has been rubbish, and I think they've been rubbish for a while on multiple issues. As I've already said in this interview, I also am not a Trump fan. So I think there's. Do I think Trump is, kind of scapegoating the WHO to cover? Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think there's some cynicism there as well. I mean, is defunding the WHO the right decision? So my view is that we need an organization like the WHO, but the WHO has stopped fulfilling that role for some time. I don't think they've been very good even on other recent pandemics. So how do you fix that? I mean, what we ideally want is an organization that is shielded from politics and data driven, right?
Easier said than done. I mean, I want that for video games. How you do that when everything is inherently political. Like, this is what's informing my questions here, because I tried after Gamergate to try to get a consortium going. There was no interest. All the game companies, even the indies, they just wanted to lock down. They wanted to give lip service to these poor, defenseless women who were attacked. Nobody really wanted to do anything. They wanted to hunker down and wait it out.
Sure. And which can be an effective strategy. I mean, to some extent, if a cynical one, but it can be, wait for the dust storm to go past and then just keep doing what you're doing.
Right.
Which I think is, again, when you end up with, in this case, the industry on one side and anti-Gamergate advocates on the other side, or Trump on one side and the WHO on the other side, you again in all these situations lose an opportunity for dialogue and compromise, right? Some of the stuff, and so, like I said, I mean, I think that Anita Sarkeesian and the Gamergate issue did raise things we needed to talk about and needed to change. On the other hand, my concern is that the anti-Gamergate movement grossly overstepped it. You know what I mean? And like so this happens with a lot of advocacy efforts. You end up with a certain amount of goodwill and credibility, and then they blow it by becoming like super extreme. And this is in no way unique to the anti-Gamergate movement. And I don't know how to convince people to find some sort of like rational, data-driven, compromising middle ground. Because again, I don't think the incentives are necessarily there. And certainly when you look at like the United Nations, so the problems with the WHO again are not limited to the WHO. This is sort of a United Nations issue that different member states have more of a voice than others, and it's not a democracy in the sense of like everybody's kind of working together towards a common
Right,
goal.
right.
Everybody's trying. It's like the Hunger Games, where everybody forms factions until
Yeah.
they pull off the other faction, and then they can turn on each other. Kind of a
Well,
thing.
and it's all people scrambling for increasingly less valuable pots of money.
Yeah.
Too. I mean, that broadband commission report, that's what it was. The mandate had shifted from broadband to status of women, and the broadband committee went, oh crap, we need to stay relevant.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Since media doesn't have much of an effect on people, do you think that education actually can change minds here?
So attitude change is tough. You know what I mean? So,
Yeah.
like, people are not inherently data driven. I'm not excluding myself from that necessarily, but on issues particularly that I'm not informed about. We all tend to make decisions emotionally, and we look for group consensus in a sense of like our own group. So whatever my friends think, I'm more likely to sort of shift in the direction of what they think, whether they're numbskulls or informed.
Right.
So it's not to say that it can't work. It takes a long game kind of perspective. So if you look at like the violent video game debate, which is one I think, or if you look at like gay marriage, is another good example. Actually, gay marriage is a fantastic example.
Because it did change opinions.
It did change opinions.
Right.
And part of the way that they did so, again, I'm painting with a broad brush, is the narrative that they came up with as a community was sort of like, this is what we want. It's not going to affect you.
Right.
Why do you care? And it's going to make you feel good to be egalitarian in a sense. So there was a clear reward, a carrot. So like, you will get to feel like a better person if you change your attitudes, and there's no downside. We don't think you're a jerk. We don't think you're an asshole. So it was a very strategic, persuasive, convincing message, and it still took generations. But
right.
There were exceptions, but they were largely able to stay on message.
That was rapid social change though on that issue.
When it finally snowballed towards the end, but that was something that was like started in the late '60s and then it was by the '90s it really started to really hit purchase, and then like I said, then it was pretty rapid once it did. But it took a long game and patience, for most individuals. Again, there were bomb throwers on both sides, of course, whatever. But the main sort of gay rights movement was very patient, stayed on message. It was a positive message for the most part. You will get to be a better human being if you get on board with this, and we're not, but they didn't highlight like you're a horrible human being if you disagree with us.
Right.
Positives, and I think, again, with Gamergate, there could have been a message of like, look, obviously some women are experiencing harassing. That's bad. You might have some legitimate concerns about games journalism. Those are okay, but we really need to also talk about, sexism and misogyny in larger culture, not just games, whatever. And maybe we can all, do you really want women to be harassed and feel bad?
I have found personally that exactly what you described works.
Yeah.
That if you broaden it to a wider culture, people like, yeah, of course there's some problems.
Yeah.
The majority, there are some people absolutely don't, but the vast majority, like, yeah, I can admit there's problems. I just don't want guilt by association lumped on me.
Right, and that's where things I think veered off, and the at least the vocal narrative became, gamers are awful, gamers are sexist, alt-right, and that's where if you do that, then you harden people, and then people will not change. It's the same thing we see with like Trump supporters versus never Trumpers versus progressives. The more you say, you guys have got to vote for our person or you're Nazis.
Yeah.
The other side will just harden in.
Yeah.
As opposed to like, I get why you voted for Trump. I understand it. I don't agree, but I understand it. Here's why you might want to rethink it. And here are some advantages for you if you change your mind, but I respect you if you don't. That's actually more persuasive, but it's harder for people. Well, like anti-vaxxing, it's more persuasive to say like, I get why you're worried about vaccines.
Right.
Here's what the data says. What would convince you, that this is where you should change your
you're giving people an opt-in there.
Yeah, it's allowing people to save face to a large degree. If you basically tell people you're an idiot, an asshole, and a Nazi, there's all they can do is that you're right. So I'm going to change
and
my
yeah.
view. They're not going to do that.
Well, that's what that sort of hard left that apparently I'm a part of does.
Yeah.
That we're all horrible, but we're economically and educationally privileged enough to go, yes, we're all horrible. Nudge, wink. We all have, post-secondary degrees and six-figure salaries. We can say we're terrible people. We have the privilege of admitting that. Most people don't, because they survive based on social status and their reputation in their community.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's that disconnect there. All right, Chris, you've given me a ton of your time. I could talk to you hours and hours and hours. We're probably going to have to split this into 2 parts, but thank you so much. And where can people go to find more about what you're up to? A lot of your papers are available publicly online. So how can people find this stuff if you've sort of wet their whistle for more?
Yeah, sure. So I have a website, which is just my name, ChristopherJFerguson.com. So it's pretty easy. And I have a couple books, so I'll pitch them real quickly, if you don't mind.
Go for it. Well, you got Moral Combat, right?
Yeah, there's Moral Combat, which is why the war on violent video games is wrong, which is pretty much what it says on the box. And I have a new one just came out, How Madness Shaped History.
Oh, yeah. I'm really interested in that because one of my favorite books of all time is Strange Brains and Genius. So I've got to read that book.
That's also pretty much what it says on the box. So we actually, in the book, I do talk a lot about like they call it madness of the masses, which is really kind of like, why people get extreme views and why those views are amplified. And I have a murder mystery novel set in Renaissance Florence called Suicide King. So this is a good time, right? We're all stuck at home, so this is a good time to read some books. So,
but don't get addicted to the books.
Don't get addicted to the books. Every chapter is designed to keep you highly engaged. There are loot boxes thrown throughout the pages.
Take breaks, get up, walk around, and stretch between chapters.
Lots of dopamine releases.
Okay, we're just being jerks right now. Chris, thanks so much for your time.
Sure thing. It's always a pleasure.